Well, Scott's actually talking about a previous incarnation. I've been at Cedar Crest for the last 20 years, and it's out of that context particularly that I want to talk to you. I've taught death and dying class at Cedar Crest for 20 years, and during that time I've seen incredible changes take place in the United States. And so what I would like to talk to you about are two of them. The first change is the development of the United States as an interfaith, interethnic nation. And the second, and that's an opportunity, the second is a liability, because I want to talk to you about the American culture of denial. And then I want to try to put those two together to see about where the opportunities might lie, particularly for things like doing CPE. First, the changes in our nation. When I got out of graduate school in 1979, I was in a department of Oriental Studies at the University of Arizona, and I'd been working on Hindu history and a particular Hindu sect. And I began to look around at that point, and what did I start seeing but Hindu temples in the United States? Now, as an undergrad at Syracuse University many years before, if you'd wanted to study Hinduism, you went to India. There really wasn't much choice, with some exceptions, including the Caribbean and other places where Indian populations had migrated. But in terms of mainstream religions in the United States, no, it hadn't happened. I began to discover that there was a reason why I began seeing Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, members of many Asian religions who most Americans had not encountered before. And the reason was a radical overhaul of U.S. immigration law in 1965. Now, I was telling some others over lunch, I have to be very careful when I'm dealing with 18 to 21-year-olds when I ever say, "Do you remember?" But I can say it to the majority of you. Do you remember 1965? Remember what was going on in our nation? Civil rights struggle, the beginnings of the Vietnam War, and the protests to the war. I have to admit it escaped my awareness, but on July 4th, at the base of the Statue of Liberty, Lyndon Baines Johnson, then president, did one of the most important things of his administration. He signed into law the First Amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924. Now, it's worth just pausing for a second to understand the ramifications of that law in 1924. It was preceded by two others, all creating a barred zone for entry into the United States, and that barred zone was most of Asia. It was also called the Johnson-Reed Act, and it was preceded the year earlier by a Supreme Court decision. It was the United States versus an Indian gentleman named Bhagat Singh Thind. Bhagat Singh Thind claimed that he should be considered Caucasian since he was Asian Indian and therefore he was of Aryan stock, and that he should be let into the United States. In an incredibly racist decision, the Supreme Court denied that. I'm also told he was a veteran of World War I, having fought, with the United States forces. But that racially biased Supreme Court decision further cemented the law a year later into effect. Between 1924 and 1965, the migration from the Eastern Hemisphere to the United States was virtually nil. That left a lot of populations of people who had already come here from Japan, the Philippines, India, the Middle East. It left them, in many cases, unable to return. They couldn't afford the cost of passage. Many then were male. Immigrants often came first. It meant they couldn't bring their families. It created enormous trauma throughout the United States. So that act of Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965 has changed the racial, ethnic, and religious landscape of America. Now, my own experience is a case in point. I was looking around for a subject within the wider area of Hindu studies to do a dissertation on, and was in India studying Hindi in 1973, and noticed that there was quite a bit of attention to a Krishna-dominated sect called Pushti Marg, which means the way of grace. And what do you know, I discovered some literature, some Pushti Margi literature, and that was fine. And so came back to the United States with a little kit, really basically to do a dissertation on. Well, all that was fine and good. I got through the degree. Moved to Allentown later, and in the 1980s, I began to hear conversation about a Hindu temple going up near Pottsville. Well, I prowled around a little more and found out it's the same sect. Most Americans had never heard of this tradition before, and the temple is not only alive and well, but it is the spiritual headquarters of this tradition in the Western Hemisphere. I've been doing continuing research with them, and they have temples all over the United States. You know them, but I bet you don't know you know them. They are mostly Gujaratis from Western India, cities like Ahmedabad, for example, or many of them hail from. But if you go into a Dunkin' Donuts and order your coffee in the morning, you've met one. And in fact, if you really want to be good about this, just as you get your coffee, just Jai Shri Krishna. You'll knock them off their socks. It's a phenomenon that has begun to dominate our shores in that there is extreme ethnic, racial, and religious diversity here, but a lot of it is often hidden. And a lot of it you might not know about unless you saw it. For example, it is now easy, believe it or not, to find a Tibetan Buddhist temple in the United States. Next Wednesday, I'm taking a Buddhism class to the Tibetan Buddhist Learning Center in northwestern New Jersey. They are there in the middle of a wooded area off a dirt road. My gosh, it looks like northern Vermont. I'm prejudiced. I have a house there, but that's where I spend some summers. But if you didn't know where they were, you probably wouldn't have heard of them. It is a temple that has housing for the Dalai Lama. When he visits the United States, roughly 8 years, every 8 years he stays there. It is a temple that was commissioned by the Dalai Lama when a group of Tibetan Buddhists, including some American devotees, were urged to try to establish that religion on our shores, and for very good reason. The Dalai Lama in 1959 escaped from Tibet after the Chinese invasion. He set up headquarters in northern India. Most Tibetan Buddhists in northern India know they will never go back. And this once mysterious religion that we hardly knew anything about, as for example detailed in the novel Lost Horizon. You ever see that movie made in the 30s, Lost Horizon? It presented this mystical image of what actually was Tibetan Buddhism, but we didn't know enough about Tibetan Buddhism for the makers of the film to even put this stuff in the mouths of Tibetan Buddhist monks. So they made the Tibetan Buddhist monks into Christian monks, figuring that Americans would understand that. But we knew nothing about Tibet, nothing. Well, now, not only can you easily find Tibetan Buddhist temples in Philadelphia or in rural Washington, New Jersey, but there is a network across the country. 20 minutes from my house in northern Vermont is a temple outside of a little town called Barnet, Vermont, with a beautiful New England church steeple. And there are actually 2 monasteries that are associated with that place. There is Shambhala International Network, which includes 170 temples throughout Europe and North America. If you look at a map, you'll find many, many, many of them on the east and west coast of the United States. There is a Tibetan Buddhist University, Naropa University, in Boulder, Colorado. There is a Nyingmapa Meditation Institute. It could go on and on. Asian religions have become American religions in the same way that all of our ancestors outside of native peoples came here from other places. I think of some of my own experience over the last 20 to 30 years. I worked with the first Hindu temple in the United States. It was in Flushing, New York. And they had the difficulty of crafting the temple the same way they had done for centuries in India, but they forgot one thing. They hadn't run into one type of worker in the United States, and that's a New York City building inspector. And the building inspectors told them that never mind, you've constructed temples for 3,000 years in India this way. In New York, you have to do it this way. Some of those poor souls had never seen a winter. They had never seen snow, and they came to construct that temple. Hindu temples are growing fast throughout the United States. Buddhist temples are growing quickly. The Sikh religion, it's spelled S-I-K-H. The word means disciple or student. We have 2 Sikh temples in Easton. There is another that's part of they call themselves ecumenical. Hindu temple north of the Lehigh Valley. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not just the phenomenon of East and West coasts. Religious pluralism is here to stay. We are a multi-faith nation. The fastest growing religion in the United States is Islam. Okay? So all of this puts us into a very different position than we have been before. Now, when this level of religious diversity started to become noticeable, interfaith movements spawned all over the country in terms of initiating dialogue among traditions. Some of those movements were institutionalized, and the religious landscape became very different because each group would define who they would relate to and by default who they would not relate to. I remember interviewing the leadership of a group in Washington, D.C. called the Interfaith Congress of Metropolitan Washington, and they advertised themselves as working in American religious pluralism. But if you looked at their membership, you would find Protestant, Catholic, Jew, and Muslim. In other words, they were fine with the monotheistic religions. But by the time you got to something like Hinduism, no, they weren't too sure they were ready to do that. And of course, the question is, when do you become ready? And can we really wait? And I would answer that no, we can't. There was along with the ecumenical movement after Vatican II in the 1960s, the interfaith movement also grew, but it really suffered enormously. Most Christian denominations, I know from my own experience, never saw it as in their best interest or as their better way of saying that would be their primary interest. So it was enormously underfunded. And dialogue became a way of bringing people together in formalized situations, which is a fine thing. But I would dare say that it didn't really meet some of the needs that we're beginning to see. How, for example, does a multi-faith nation deal with issues of death and dying? How does a multi-faith nation deal with issues of aging? Interfaith dialogue in academic settings or in community settings is a wonderful thing, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need another model. Now, let me sketch out what I see to you as a problem, and then I want to come back and talk about what a model of engagement might look like in this culture of ours. So back to the premise. We have changed radically in the last 20 to 30 years. If I stretched it a little bit further in terms of what I'm about to say, I would add since World War II, not in terms of interfaith, but in terms of creating the American culture of denial. Denial in the United States, the denial of death, is something that individuals do, but it is also profoundly cultural. It is supported by millions and millions of dollars, making it very difficult to deal openly and honestly with the subject of aging and death. Let me just give you some of the parameters that I've seen. First of all, growing up in the 60s, and again, I can say that to you all, remember the John F. Kennedy's era? It was a youth era. It was great, we thought. This was the American youth culture, which is still around. But look at us. Now we're all boomers, right? Now we're looking at the other end of life. But along with the youth culture have been some liabilities, because the liabilities are, what about people who are aging? And what about valuing people who are aging? That was lost sight of. And I dare say it moved very quickly into denial because there's the assumption that if you're getting older, you're closer to death. Now, that's not true necessarily at all, and we all know it. In short, the American culture of denial has created a taboo, and the taboo is death itself. It is a radical change from what happened a century before. A century before, in the Victorian era, in the 19th century, one dared not talk about issues like sex, dared not. But most people did talk about death. They wrote about it. They thought about deathbed scenes. I have a little diary composed by one of my ancestors in 1864 in northern Vermont. And I often read her entry to my class on New Year's Eve. She wrote on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1864, she said, "Thank heavens God has spared my life this year. I hope he will spare my life next year." Well, Happy New Year. I mean, the reason is she was in the cultural norm thinking about death when the year changed. Nothing wrong with that in the 19th century, and most people would have understood that. Try that at a New Year's Eve party now. And in fact, if you should mention that at a New Year's Eve party, you'll find people moving away from you rather quickly. So we have made death into a taboo. Now, I dare say that's one of the reasons why classes like mine or in so many other institutions on death and dying are populated regularly. I can always count on my death and dying course enrolling. I wish I could say that was because of me. It's because this is a forbidden topic. And what these courses do is give you permission to talk about it. And as we go through the course, talking about death becomes a normal, accepted activity. Why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we be curious? We're all mortal. We're all in the same human condition. But denial is supported by an even broader array of moneyed industries. Where do you start in naming them? Well, you could start with the funeral industry. It's not fair, however, to just put blame on the funeral industry because they're giving us what they think we want. And what it all comes down to are funerals that are wake-centered, funerals in which the deceased is made to look like they just fell asleep. You know, when you come in front of a casket and here's the family over here, you can't just walk by, you're supposed to stop for a minute. And then when you get to the family, what are you supposed to say? "Oh, how good Uncle George looks," or "how good Jane looks." No. They're dead. And we don't seem to recognize that fact. And that's complicated by our language, as was said this morning. We use euphemisms. I've had the same experience that our speaker has had this morning. One of my jobs is preparing death notices for people, for faculty and for staff who have died at Cedar Crest. And one of the support staff said to me, "You mean you don't say they've died? You don't say passed away?" "No, I don't. I say they have died." There's a long list of euphemisms online, all the way from bought the farm to kicked the bucket. The one I like as an academic is if you're remaindered, you know. There's just armloads of these. So we talk around death instead of naming it for what it is. It's all part of the culture of denial. Look at the entertainment industry. There is rampant denial of death. Not only is death temporary, but it becomes routine. Films like the Die Hard series have been studied by, I think he's deceased, he's dead now, an academic at the University of Pennsylvania named George Gerbner. He had his grad students doing body counts in each successive Die Hard movie, and found that they went up exponentially. Well, why do we do this? Why is death such an important part of Hollywood films? Most of us have, I dare say, the wrong idea as to the motives. Some people will say, well, they're giving us what we want. Do we really want it? But the real reason is a pragmatic reason that you'll hate when you hear it. It's about bucks. It's about export. It's that if you are exporting a film, if you're exporting a comedy, what kind of work do you have to do to get the comedy into another country? You have to recast it practically, because American humor is not like Asian humor, it's not like British humor, right? It's expensive. If you have a movie like Die Hard, all you got to do is dub it, bang, bang, you're dead, sells any place, okay? So it really does come down to that motive. And the industry also, not only does it portray a lot of violent death, and you have to think about that for a second, by the way. It's creating an artificial realm that is apart from the death experience of almost everybody we know. Most of us are not going to die that way. It creates misinformation. All of the death-related things that have come across the media recently, and there's a lot of them, and what I'm saying is not an attempt to minimize them at all, but to put it in context. Are you aware that if you look at the FBI statistics over the last 30 to 40 years, the level of violent crime in the United States has steadily been decreasing? Decreasing. but yet films give us the opposite impression. Films also rarely show grief. A character is simply removed and they're gone and life somehow returns to normal. It's almost, it sort of spawns the phrase, you get over a death. I don't think you do. I don't think you ever get over a death. You may learn how to live with it, but you never get over it. So the film industry rampantly denies. The food industry rampantly denies death. How many times, if you're buying a steak, do you see an image of the cow with the parts named right above that? What would happen to your little child going through the line, they say? So remember those times when kids finally make the connection between, the meat, and that's really the animal? The industry tends to deny it. Remember the old ads for, probably Colonel Sanders chicken, where you can tell people you're killing chicken if you can convince them that they're really dumb birds. Then it's okay. It's like trying to convince people that pigs are really stupid. Neither animal is really stupid. In fact, in a rural area, I've had friends make friends out of chickens, and they follow you around like cats and dogs. They'll talk to you. They become, really part of the family. But we don't want to admit that. So the food industry, the cosmetics industry is probably one of the largest industries in the world, and it works very hard at trying to get us not to show age, because age walks right up to the possibility of death that we're not supposed to discuss. The medical industry, we talked about that this morning, life at all costs. The term expired is more common than the term dead. Do we ever use that term? Are you going to expire? Most of us don't use that. Many older school physicians, thank heavens, not as much among the younger generations of physicians, see death as a failure, and for those reasons do not want to talk about it. And what I'm trying to suggest is that the causes, the manifestations of denial are rampant in the United States, and it makes it very difficult for us to talk about death and dying. Very quickly, I want to go through some causes of denial, and some of this may surprise you. If you look at U.S. culture in the Civil War, and even a little thereafter, until World War I, there was one dominant image of death, and it was known as the good death. If I was given a Christian burial, people thought, even if my remains were taken from the battlefield and buried properly, then death was not only okay, but it was also like a family reunion. I would be buried near my family members, and I would get to see them once again. That image survived the Civil War. It's hard to understand how it did. There were the new figures of the deceased in the Civil War have just been revised. It was about 750,000. Enormous. The images of the good death survived until World War I. Frankly, the deaths in the trench warfare in Europe, the gassings that took place, this image of the good death simply could not continue. Now look very quickly at other forces at work in then the 20th century, the increasingly secularized America that we came to live in. And most of the denial of death that we have seen came after the end of the Second World War. Returning GIs to America on the GI Bill, able to afford housing, the construction of the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, what all that meant was that you could drive away from death. The mobility increased radically for most Americans. And that meant visiting cemeteries, even knowing where your ancestors were buried, didn't happen as often. So what we have begun to see coming up through the Cold War and into the present is a magnification of secular imagery, of religious imagery in a secular context. So the image of death as the enemy now is a secular image of death, and it shows up in film left and right. Death is the stranger that comes to get us. Death is the outsider. Now, I've got to admit, I grew up watching the old Gunsmoke series. Guys, remember that? It was on radio first. James Arness, Matt Dillon, this went on for like 20 some odd years. What was the most common plot It was everything is nice in Dodge City. Everybody's getting along with everybody else until some stranger rides in. The stranger is from out of town and nobody knows him, and the stranger is a purveyor of death. So you eliminate the stranger and it's a deathless society. Now there are no worries. Those images became very, very common. Part of the images of denial also, by the way, began to include the image of kids. Kids don't die in film. Very, very rarely. I like to show clips of film teaching death and dying, and I often show them a clip from Jurassic Park. Remember the scene where the two young kids are in this car, and there's a T-Rex battering the car. And by the way, T-Rex was a Cretaceous period dinosaur, not Jurassic. So they sort of slipped that one in. But who in that, if you remember that scene, the car is torn apart, the kids are scared to death. They tell the kids, don't worry, he can't smell you. Well, that's not true from what we know of their olfactory senses. But one man runs for cover and goes into the portable toilet where the dinosaur kills him. So, okay, he dies sitting on the throne. But who is he? He's a lawyer. And did we think lawyers are expendable? Yeah, sure. But not kids. Very rarely do kids die in film, and that's part of our denial. Death hits us all, and our culture is very selective in terms of how it talks about that. Now, I want to give you some sense of at least where I think this could be headed. How do we bring these two forces together? The increasingly interfaith identity of America, a multi-faith nation in every respect, and the American culture of denial. First of all, I would suggest to you that we probably would be very well served if we listened to our new neighbors who have come from other places in the United States, because it's very, very rare for traditional societies to deny death. I'll give you some examples. On the front page of the New York Times last week was a color photo of what's called the tomb cleaning ceremony in mainland China, going on right now. One day a year, people will come in, sweep up their tombs, and often make cash offerings by burning money so that their ancestors will also have financial support. I've seen that same thing happen at the Xuanyan Monastery in New York State. I'm going there in about 10 days with a group of students. It's the largest Buddha in the Western Hemisphere. It's 37 feet tall. I watched them build the building around the Buddha, which was incredible. But last year, they have a bank of areas where they bury the cremains of people who have died. This is largely a Chinese facility. And I saw some ashes, and I saw some play money in the ashes. That's what was going on. They were burning money so that the funds would go to their deceased ancestors. There's no denial there. In another room, they maintain shelves of cremains for a month, while tape recordings of Buddhist chants are chanted to the ashes. There's no denial there. Throughout so many of the traditional cultures who have come here, there is a denial-less attitude, and I think we need to learn from them. There are also changes in hospital settings that I think are really worth noting. One of the largest hospitals on the Eastern Seaboard has been Elmhurst Hospital in New York City. It's in Queens. This is in an area that the borough of Elmhurst has 2 to 3 million people. It is the most diverse place I have ever seen. There are people from 100 different nations there. I have been in a restaurant that sells Indonesian food, not to non-Indonesians, but for the Indonesian people who are there. There are Nepalis. There are people from all over. Now, how does a hospital deal with a situation like this? Well, for years, Elmhurst maintained a volunteer corps of about 200 people. They were engaged in translation projects. They were engaged in helping patients fill out paperwork, and it was a wonderful thing to see. But it's changed. Now, in fact, according to an article not that long ago, now doctors and nurses are going out into the community talking to interfaith religious leaders. They are going out talking to cultural centers. And some of them are even traveling abroad to better understand the places where their patients have come from. That's the kind of grassroots involvement that we need. And I dare say that one of the fruits of that kind of grassroots involvement is going to break the back on the culture of denial. We had a group of students just come back from Costa Rica. The entire class went over spring break to Costa Rica. And some of my death and dying students came back just astounded at what they saw. Because what they saw were young adults their age, as they put it, hanging out in the cemetery at night. Now you ask that question of 18 to 21-year-olds, where are you going to spend your time when you're not here? Are you going to go to the cemetery? As far away from it as they can get. But what they noticed was that there was no denial going on there at all. There's a festival called Dia de los Muertos, Festival of the Dead. I've seen it in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It draws thousands in Hollywood, in San Francisco, and in other places throughout the United States. This is that day during the year when you cook up a storm and you bring it to the cemetery and you eat it with your ancestors. Now, the old saw used to be that this is ancestor worship. It's not. It's veneration of ancestors. It's knowing who came before you, and it's respecting them and showing that respect. In the culture of denial, as was mentioned this morning, I talked to many students, like what was said this morning, where the names of the deceased are never, ever again repeated in the home. So what I'm suggesting is that by helping Interfaith America become more visible, by helping Interfaith America to become more accepted, more mainstreamed, there's also a benefit. And the benefit is that they can help us breaking this taboo that prevents us from talking about the essential issues of life, death, and aging. Thank you. Yeah, I tried to shut myself up, so. What's that?
If you'd repeat the question when it's asked, that we will get it.
Sure. Are there some questions? No? Questions? Comments? Idle thoughts? Yes.
This is a common problem. This problem of denial is so difficult to work with. And I see your idea as a good one because if we can make people more aware of the fact that we really are going to die, no matter what medicine has done, it's not going to keep us alive forever. But how do we get the message past all these big businesses that don't want us to think that?
That is the $64,000 question. How do we get the message across to big businesses that don't want us to think that? Well, I think in a capitalist society that big business does try to give us what they think we want. And you know that we're being studied left and right. You know that our internet choices are being logged. And so industry is getting very sophisticated at finding out what we want and what we don't want. So I think the answer to your question has to begin with us. It has to begin with a greater willingness to talk about these issues in the classroom, in conferences, and even more than that, at home. I often urge my students to think about death education. I ask them, how many of you have had even formal sex education? A lot of homes, that doesn't even happen. But death education, we don't even know how to do it. How do you begin a conversation with kids about death? Well, you take them where they're at. Sometimes when they're playing in themes related to death, there's an opportunity. And there are lots of opportunities to bring death back into the conversation in the American home, to start there, and ultimately to change what we want, and they'll listen. We've got to start with us, I think. Other questions? Yes?
In your study of aging religion, are there any religious traditions that look at suicide in a justifiable way?
That's a very difficult question. Historically, there have been national cultures informed by Asian religions. I'm thinking of the kamikaze movement during the Second World War. But at this point, I'm not aware of any Asian religions that would, but it also depends how you talk about suicide. There's been a lot of work in the late 20th century on redefining suicide. A lot of work on some things as what's called subintentional suicide, that the subconscious processes that might push somebody into experimenting with death and ultimately leading to a death. So the whole area has undergone different.
I was about to say, how about the suicide bombers? Suicide bombers. I mean, maybe it's political reasons.
It's very political reasons, and part of the issue really, I should let my colleague and friend Mohammed talk about that one, but the issue of suicide bombers has been portrayed as representing mainstream Islam, and it absolutely does not. Islam absolutely denies the validity of those acts, and it's very important to say that. And actually, that brings up another subject, and the other, just very quickly, it's well worth noting. None of the Asian religions in America have come here easily. Almost all of them have had very difficult times erecting temples and mosques. Getting the assent of a local zoning board is not an easy thing to do. And compounding that are the stereotypes like that of suicide bombers that makes it very difficult for mainstream Muslims to have their faith understood. So I also think that part of our task on a grassroots level is promoting religious understanding and helping to rid ourselves of stereotypes that also inhibit our conversations about death. Yes, sir?
Is our belief in immortality a denial of death?
That's a really good question. I often wonder about that when I'm teaching ancient Egyptian religion. I don't think so. And I think you have to take this religion by religion. It's hard to give, any blanket statement. But when I look at ancient Egyptian religion, for example, they believed that the afterlife was quite physical. I mean, yes, you could take it with you. And they routinely stocked their tombs, which they would buy at a young age, with furniture. So it'd be kind of like going to a swap meet and, oh, that's a beautiful, easy chair. I'm going to put that in my tomb. And they would have, thought that way. But that doesn't mean that death didn't hurt. That didn't mean, their belief system didn't mean that death was as much of a loss for them as it is for us. So I think religions have correctives for that. I don't think secular culture does. And I think that that's why denial has become more full-blown as we've become more secular. But I think in the context of traditional religions, belief in an afterlife is not at all necessarily denial of death. It could be manipulated to be that, but just my personal belief is that it's not a denial. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain the fastest growing religion is Islam?
Well, Islam has been in the United States for... Thank you. She wanted me to explain why Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States. Again, my colleague Mohammed is better equipped to answer that than I am. But Islam was first seen in the United States through slave religion. And it also developed before World War I through immigrant traditions. So it's been here a long time. And it also its growth has accelerated since 1965. Now, part of the answer to your question, I believe, is that Islam is truly a global religion practiced in many different countries. We have two large mosques in the Lehigh Valley, one Shia and the other Sunni. The Sunni mosque, which is on Shott Avenue, includes Muslims from 26 different countries. And so that explains a lot of the rapid growth that's here. Others? Yes?
I'm having a little trouble with the concept that other nations don't deny death. In my experience here in the States, because when I'm seeing people from these nations in the hospital, it seems to me that they use their religion to deny death.
Okay. Well, the world is not as black and white as maybe we think it is. I think I'm about to take some students to India in May. And, you know, darn it, when you sit down in New Delhi, you think you're in Chicago. High-rise buildings all over the place, an up-to-date subway system that's accurate to the minute. It's clean, it's beautiful. It looks like you really haven't gone anyplace. So what we're talking about is the impact of globalization. Not only has East come West, but West has also gone East. So people growing up throughout the Asian world are also now practicing Western values, and they also are becoming secularized. So it's not like there's one reality there and another reality here. But what I'm suggesting is that the religious presence for so much of these Asian traditions in the United States does attempt to go back to roots. It does attempt to go back to a pre-secular era. And those are the voices that I think we need to hear in terms of cracking the back of this denial. But what you're seeing is perfectly understandable because it's, again, that it's the Western presence throughout the world is very, very strong and people are picking up values of denial. How could they not? Our movies are exported all over the world. How could they not pick them up? Yes?
Last question.
You talked about starting a conversation. I'm not sure about other faiths, but I know for us Christians, the third article of the Creed in confirmation class is a wonderful way to start a conversation.
Sure.
Looking at the resurrection of the dead. I had a colleague who told me a story. They're talking about death and dying on their third article of the Creed. The young man talked about wanting to donate his organs. He unfortunately, about 2 years later, was in a car accident and died. The pastor held the family back to their son wanted because they had begun a conversation in confirmation class.
That's great. So the question is about starting conversations. Certainly a confirmation class is a great way to do that. But I also think that there are opportunities every day. You know, when you go through the Dunkin' Donuts line, don't go through in your vehicle. It produces cleaner air if you don't anyway. But go in and talk to some of those folks about where they come from. You can get into some amazing conversations. I've been able to do pieces of research there. You'll find that a lot of times they even come from the same village. Go into a New York City subway stall, you're going to see the same thing. The next time you're out of town and checking into a motel, smell the Indian food, and find out who's running the motel. Most folks in most traditions that come here from someplace else are very willing to talk about who they are and what their background is. Begin with the small stuff. Food's a great opener for this kind of conversation. Work into things like death and dying. But I truly think those are the levels of conversation that need to happen. Okay? You're welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it.